Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast. Last week we discussed pioneering female coach Emma Hayes. Be sure to give it a listen. Welcome to Heroes and Humans. Today's episode is on Thomas Tuchel, a brilliant, fanatic, dark, and sometimes even cruel German coach and one of the few elite managers in the world who's managed to win a Champions League in 2021 with my beloved Chelsea. So in this episode, Simon, we're going to explore the life, the character, and some of the esoteric methods of the 50-year-old Tuchel, who believes in the healing powers of Ayurvedic medicine. He barely drinks or even eats, and I think has the visage of an ascetic Trappist monk. And certainly compared to some of the other managers that we've spoken about so far on this podcast, he does cut quite a lithe figure.
Yeah, I would say his eating intake per day is probably 10% Carlo Ancelotti's.
So Tuchel has been dubbed a dictator, quote, and psychopath by some of his former players. And then there's others who say that he's changed the course of their playing careers and also their lives. This is a story of a manager who I think his fastidiousness borders on mania. He has some of the perfectionist instincts of Pep Guardiola, as we've spoken about before. And he can also fall prey to emotional outbursts like one of his compatriots, Jürgen Klopp. But I think Tuchel, who's currently jobless, doesn't look like he's going to hit the heights of being considered as one of the GOATs of his generation.
He's not going to hit the great goated heights.
He's not going to hit the great goated heights. And that's because he keeps self-immolating. Every time he's at a club and it's going pretty well, Tuchel does something to mess it up. We call this the Tuchel cycle. And that's why he's going to be unemployed again this summer. And in light of Gareth Southgate's recent departure from the England team, Tuchel is being considered as one of the candidates to replace him.
And stick around to the end where Mehreen and I fantasize about Thomas Tuchel, England manager. What would that be like?
I might even have to start supporting England.
No, don't do that.
Before we start, we should do a little disclaimer on his pronunciation of his name, which everyone gets wrong, including me, but not as wrong as most people.
Well, I mean, you did get it wrong. And I was sitting there in the introduction thinking, oh no. So it's not Thomas, it's Thomas.
It is Thomas.
And it's hard O, long O, Thomas. The Tuchel, the CH sound is really hard in German, especially for someone who grew up with Dutch
Tuchel.
and then had to learn German. So it's not a hard H. It's almost inaudible. It's Tuchel. You hardly hear the CH. It's Tuchel. Thomas Tuchel.
But it's not Tuchel and it's not Tuchel, which is what
Tuchel, which when I live in Paris, and when he was at Paris St Germain, the Thomas Tuchel thing really threw me.
And I think in the UK, the classic pronunciation is Tuchel.
Yeah.
Which is also wrong.
Yeah.
Tuchel, which is really wrong.
In German has connotations of backside.
Also in English, actually.
Right.
Tush.
Yeah, from Yiddish.
Yeah. The Tuchel doesn't have a backside.
No, he's like an ironing board. Yeah, he's completely straight.
So, Simon, when did you first come across Thomas?
I was talking to someone from Mainz some years ago and I was already sort of dimly aware of Tuchel, but he told me about this incredibly weird guy. And I've kept an eye on him ever since. And then through his Dortmund period where this was before his complex personality was widely understood. And he was just seen as the crown prince of football managers. Yeah,
it's quite striking to see how his characterizations, particularly in the German media, have evolved. From being the genius professor, clearly better than Jürgen Klopp, to now, this slightly, I'm going to call him a bit of a Batman type figure. But I'm also going to put all my cards on the table. I think he's my favourite Chelsea manager of recent times for the obvious reason that he did win us a Champions League after 4 months of being manager, and when we were completely crap, he turned our fortunes around.
Your favourite of the last 30 or 40 or so who've filed through.
Who's just been, we've had about 15 in the last 7 years or something. If he doesn't get a job this summer, I'm actively lobbying for him to come back to Chelsea because, quite frankly, I need some closure. His departure was very abrupt. I'm not really over it. I don't really understand what happened and I want him back.
We're going to get to what exactly happened, why they got rid of their one successful manager thing.
I think he's a very, very complicated person. And even fans like me, Chelsea fans or people who think Tuchel is a great manager, don't really know that much about him. So we've spoken about Pep. He's a serial winner and an innovator. Arsene Wenger is quite a tragic pioneer of the game.
All these are past episodes, people.
These are all past episodes. Klopp is a cult icon and an idol for so many. And I think Tuchel is an anti-hero. He comes across as quite serious, cerebral, and even boring. But he's also mad, cruel, and behaves in quite stupid ways that you just don't think is befitting of a person of his clear intelligence and stature. Football is everything that he has, but it's also the thing that's going to ruin him. And I think Thomas Tuchel is a tortured soul and probably one of the most fascinating managers currently in the modern game.
I feel quite daunted. I hadn't realised this was going to be a psychoanalytic.
This is going to be quite a deep episode.
Right. Yeah, trigger warnings, everybody.
There's going to be a lot of COD psychoanalysis going on here on my part.
Yeah, I'll try to push back. Mehreen, let's start with some stats.
Thomas Tuchel built the most successful Borussia Dortmund team in history to have never won the Bundesliga. He's also the first manager to ever get to 2 consecutive Champions League finals with 2 different teams in 2020 and 2021. And in 2024, he has the ignominy of being the first manager in over a decade not to win the Bundesliga with Bayern Munich. Simon, tell us a little bit about TT's early life.
So, Thomas Tuchel, born 1973 in Krumbach, Swabia, which is the same part of Bavaria as the man who will forever be in his rearview mirror, Jürgen Klopp. Young Thomas plays football, handball, athletics, but his dad is a football coach and helps Tuchel become the best footballer of his age at school. Now, his dad encourages him to take it seriously with, as we'll see, quite damaging consequences. Tuchel is a defender, not quick or dominant, but decent technique, and occasionally wanders into defensive midfield. He's at Stuttgarter Kickers in the second Bundesliga, and his teammates say he's a bit too clever for a footballer. He often ignores the more stupid players. He does not get drunk, which in a 90s dressing room marks you out as an object of suspicion.
So the young Tuchel doesn't drink, but enjoys football, and his idea of a good time is to invite some of his teammates round to his little flat in Stuttgart, make some soup or spaghetti bolognese, and watch the early 1990s team of Barcelona under Johan Cruyff and Ajax, 2 teams, Simon, who you also adore.
Yeah, well, Tuchel has very good taste in football.
His career actually doesn't last very long, and it ends quite tragically after he's forced to retire at the age of 25 after a knee injury which he just can't shake off. Which means Tuchel never actually makes it to the Bundesliga. He's always played in the lower ranks. But he does pick up some experience under a certain coach called Ralf Rangnick at
Ralf Rangnick.
Right.
I would hate listeners to get German pronunciation from someone who grew up in Holland, but this is a better approximation than Mehreen's.
But nobody can understand what you're saying.
Okay. Ralf Rangnick, he is one of the pioneers of what you could call modern football, of pressing football in Germany. A very innovative coach. Unfortunately, in England, he inserted himself into the reputation shredding machine that is Manchester United. But like all modern Manchester United managers, he's better than his time at Manchester United.
Yes, and I think actually probably did get a lot of respect for his time at United. And I think Ralf at some point is going to be worth an episode. But Tuchel is part of this early experiment, which we've spoken about in previous episodes, where Rangnick and others decide that the old sweeper system that German football has been playing for decades is going to be ditched. And Tuchel himself plays a centre-back at Ulm under Ralf Rangnick and is part of this sort of early revolution and some of the methods he's later going to use in his own teams, a bit like somebody else that we've spoken about, Jürgen Klopp.
Jürgen Klopp, yeah. He also converted to belief in the flat back four. He's also a Swabian, also played centre-back, also launched his career at Mainz. Are they twins, separated at birth?
I think Thomas Tuchel's the evil twin, which is why he is, of course, the better twin. Everyone knows that.
So Tuchel, he's 25, he's crocked. He's not going to become a footballer. And he's also lost out on his university degree studying English, which he failed to complete because of football. He's got no money. He starts waiting tables and working in a bakery. Football seems to be over for him. He even enrolls in a business administration course at university. But Rangnick, who's now in the Bundesliga, says, "Hey, Thomas, do you want to manage the Stuttgart youth team?"
Early Tuchel bites his hands off. He gets some of his coaching badges and quite quickly at Stuttgart he starts impressing. He's got this ability to find weaknesses in the opposition teams and he's really good at developing the innovative Rangnick style of zonal ball possession tactics. He's obsessive, he's tactical and he has this attention to detail which baffles a lot of his assistant managers and the other coaches at Stuttgart because of how anal he is. Thomas Tuchel is spending hours and hours after training working out how to do this new zonal system. He tries to overload his players with lots of information. And it's also at this point in his early career where he comes across another very, very young man called Julian Nagelsmann.
In 2008, Tuchel moves from Stuttgart to Augsburg, and there he meets somebody who's actually very like himself. This bright, young central defender, Julian Nagelsmann, whose career, like Tuchel's, has also been ended early by injury, and who also doesn't know what to do next. What's he going to do with his life, this kid Nagelsmann? And Tuchel says, well, go and scout this tiny local team, this kind of village team called Gersthofen, because they're going to play Augsburg reserves. So you do opposition scouting on them. And Nagelsmann goes to this tiny, irrelevant game with his wife. The wife films the game with a handheld camera. Nagelsmann then watches the scenes over and over obsessively, and then comes to Tuchel with his scouting report. So it's exactly what Tuchel would have done in that situation when having to analyse a village team. He kind of puts way too much of himself into it. Tuchel says, you're also a monomaniac, workaholic. You should become a manager too, like me. And Nagelsmann does, and age 28, he becomes the youngest coach in Bundesliga history at Hoffenheim. And so what you see with Tuchel, Nagelsmann, is these guys, they don't play football, but they start studying football very, very young. I mean, when Jose Mourinho was asked why people who hadn't played often become good coaches like himself, he said, more time to study. And so Tuchel and Nagelsmann are doing this studying of the game from very young. So at 28, Nagelsmann is really a kind of experienced football thinker.
Tuchel impresses quite early on, and Mainz, the club that he played for, have him on their radar. So they bring him in to manage their youth team. Then they get promoted to the Bundesliga, and they think it's time for a change because their current manager is not up to it. And they look towards Thomas Tuchel, a story of a obscure, perhaps unexpected Mainz manager, which is a story we've told before with Jürgen Klopp. How does it happen for Thomas, Simon?
Mainz have had Jürgen Klopp as manager for 7 years.
The greatest manager in Mainz's history and the most loved.
Yeah, the whole town loves him. Please listen to our Klopp podcast because it's quite emotional, even the Mainz bit. And Klopp leaves in 2008 to go to Dortmund. They appoint a Danish manager, gets promoted, but they're not happy. The club isn't happy. And so they decide we need a new manager. At this point, Thomas Tuchel is managing the under-19s team at Mainz. So he's a complete nobody, never had a proper career. He's managing the under-19s, but the club execs think he's a smart guy. So when they need a new coach, they say, Thomas, this is an incredible opportunity for you. You're a nobody, but you could take over the first team in the Bundesliga. Now, obviously, if you're a no-name youth coach, you're going to say, yeah, totally, guys, I'll be there in 4 seconds. Tuchel is different. He says, before I'll even discuss this with you, I have to go home for family dinner and to put my daughters to bed. And then he arrives at the club offices late for his appointment for this career-changing meeting. And he says, you know what? I'm not ready to become head coach. I want at least 2 weeks to prepare to scout my own team, etc. I can't just step in like this in this random way. And the clubs say, listen, you're a nobody. A nobody is never going to be given weeks of prep time before starting his first job in the Bundesliga. You will only ever get a chance like this in an emergency. You would be well advised to take it. So finally he says, oh, well, okay.
I wonder even at that early point whether he's worried about stepping into the shadow of Jürgen Klopp. This becomes a theme in his life because he does shadow Jürgen Klopp because he also ends up at Borussia Dortmund. They face each other later in the Premier League, and Jürgen Klopp is definitely the ghost that stalks Thomas Tuchel's professional career. It's something, the comparisons he can't ever get off his back, and the comparisons which later in his career become very unfavourable towards him.
Because Klopp has this incredible ease with people and this happiness in his own skin, which Tuchel utterly lacks.
And Simon, you think that this culture of recruiting managers who've never really had football careers is in the great German tradition of learning on the job?
Well, there is a German tradition of on-the-job training in all professions. The kind of apprenticeship idea, which, in British politics, they've been talking about for decades about how to have apprenticeships for plumbers and electricians.
Yeah, we sort of lionise this German method of
but
apprenticeships.
It's generally true. I mean, you learn a Fach, you learn a trade, and you learn it with a master who teaches you the trade. That's the kind of tradition since the Middle Ages. And you get a diploma because Germans love diplomas. You really have to study to be a plumber, say. In football, the way it's always worked, of course, was you were a great footballer, you retire, you've never thought for 4 seconds about how to manage, and somebody gives you a big club. That's the kind of Wayne Rooney, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard story. Usually doesn't work out brilliantly. And the Germans did that as well. But then in the last 15 years or so, 20 years, they've moved much more to an idea of hang on, being a coach is also a trade that you need to study. And I think Joachim Löw, who was Germany manager when they won the World Cup, was a great pioneer of this, because Löw was actually a decent journeyman footballer, but he had really studied coaching. He was much more a coach than a footballer, and he kind of showed that having played really wasn't that important. In Germany, they don't need to have played, they just need to have thought and studied football. And Thomas Tuchel is exactly that figure.
He's definitely very studious and very meticulous. And also at Mainz, very quickly, even though he's a young unknown who's managing in the Bundesliga, an honour I don't think that he would have expected in his early 30s, he starts exhibiting some of the traits of crazed behaviour, but also one of the hallmarks of his early team, which is idea of being tactically very, very fluid. We've spoken a little bit before in previous episodes about how Ancelotti discovers that it's not good to be a rigid sort of manager. Tuchel's not exactly in the same vein, but his whole ethos driving a lot of his teams is that they're not going to be predictable. So at Mainz, within the first couple of matches, he changes up to 5 or 6 players a game. And this is baffling to the German media, to the sports journalists who don't really understand why you would have such high turnover so quickly when you're trying to develop and establish a team. One of the things that he also loves is something called differential learning. Thomas Tuchel spends a lot of time reading sports science books. This is the idea that your training sessions are incredibly intense. The whole purpose of training is to overburden players with information and give them obstacles on the pitch. So when it comes to actual match day, and they are playing in much easier conditions where it's much easier to find solutions because some of the training that you've been put through is so much harder. And these are quite esoteric methods for this day. One of the things that he makes players do, and I think he's done this at all this club, is to play with tennis balls. So much smaller balls. You're doing one-to-ones, attack versus defense. He makes them wear the sort of shirts that you can't pull because then defenders and attackers have to use their body to protect the ball or to defend the ball. And he almost never plays on a full-size pitch. Thomas Tuchel is always cutting the corners of the pitch to make it about a third smaller, so the spaces are tighter. He's creating...
This is what they do at Barcelona as well. So a lot of training at Barcelona, you'll play an 11-11 match in
never on a
half
full-size
a field.
pitch. Yeah, and these are all the sort of obstacles and the overburdening that he's trying to do, because when it comes to actual match day, he thinks his players will be able to solve problems really quickly. He loves making players do passing drills where they have to pass between each other hundreds and hundreds of times, the same pass over and over again. But it's not just repetition. He throws things like maths equations at them. He throws problems at them.
You have to solve a maths equation while you're doing the passing.
Exactly, because then the point is that your brain is sort of thinking about the solution you need to find to the maths problem, the question he's just answer you, and the passing becomes intuitive. You actually develop an instinct for the pass because your brain is on something else. I've also learned that when people go running or do exercise and they listen to podcasts, they exert far more mental and physical energy when they're doing two things at the same time. So if you are listening to this, put your trainers on, go for a run. And Simon and I could actually help you develop your brain and body far better than you may have done otherwise.
You burn more calories while running if you're listening to a podcast also. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, because you're doing the differential learning. You're overburdening your body and your brain with information and tasks to do at the same time. And so Thomas Tuchel is now getting far more attention from the German media and from the Bundesliga in general, and he revels in this image that he's created of himself as somebody that has quite unique methods, and the tag that he gives himself is rule breaker. There is this almost TED-style talk on YouTube, which is in German, but you can get it with some subtitles, where Thomas Tuchel talks about how much being unpredictable and taking some of the things that Rangnick taught him, but not being the kind of guy that is going to deploy one sort of strategy to win a game. And I think also, again, he's trying to differentiate himself from Jürgen Klopp. And this rule breaker tag is something that he revels in to such an extent that it becomes a kind of cultish elite club membership where Tuchel is part of this group of German entrepreneurs, of business people who all see themselves as sort of contrarian mavericks, and they call themselves the rule breakers.
Oh God, these are people who say things like, I can think out of the box.
Yes, exactly. These are the sort of people who I guess in today's day and age have like special elite Discord chats for themselves because they are so contrarian and against the mainstream opinion. And at the beginning, it works. So the German media think Thomas Tuchel is going to have a brilliant career. They call him the professor. They think he's clearly got the genius and the tactics and the acumen to usurp Jürgen Klopp. And at the beginning, in that first season, it's going pretty well for Thomas Tuchel. And as we'll find out, the Thomas Tuchel cycle always starts with an initial period of excitement, overperformance, and you think, my God, this guy is going to change everything for us. So Tuchel's first 4 seasons at Mainz are the most successful in the club's history. And
even more than Jürgen Klopp's, even more than Kloppo, who was the hero of Mainz but did get relegated with the
great
club.
Kloppo. In those 4 seasons, Mainz have the best record in the Bundesliga outside of the 4 big teams, Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund, Bayer Leverkusen, and at that point, RB Leipzig. However, as we're going to come to find out, there are always signs of trouble towards the end. In his final season, a lot of drama happens, one of which is that the club's former goalkeeper sues Tuchel and Mainz because he thinks that they're deliberately not playing him so he's not going to get some of his players' bonuses. The goalkeeper who testifies in court against Tuchel personally calls him a bully and a dictator. There's a great viral clip on YouTube of Thomas Tuchel berating one of his players, Sean Parker. He's screaming at him at the top of his lungs, telling him that he doesn't know how to play the team's game. All he's doing is step-overs and tricks. And then he hoofs the ball at him and makes him run after it. And these are the first early signs that we get that Thomas Tuchel, when his perfectionist standards are not met, can become unhinged.
Not, I would say, totally in accord with current best HR practices at leading corporations.
And actually, the end at Mainz is acrimonious. Tuchel leaves behind quite a divided changing room. There's the players who love him, but those who don't really understand how he was able to be so cruel to them in quite extreme moments. When he leaves, he does this very heartfelt speech to the changing room where he tells everyone about, what a brilliant career-changing, life-changing few years he's had. And some of the players, a bit like, I think, being in a toxic relationship, they just don't think this is sincere, right? So they've seen him at his worst moments and they don't believe the heartfelt, teary goodbye.
This is very unlike Jürgen Klopp, where everybody always believes the heartfelt, teary goodbye. They genuinely think Klopp loves them.
And Klopp doesn't really expose so much of his dark side to his players, not from what we know. There are very few testimonies of people calling Klopp a bully or a dictator.
No, it's only referees who don't like Klopp.
And Lewis Holtby, who's one of the young great promises of that Mainz team, sums up Thomas Tuchel. And he says the coach always oscillates between perfectionism and humanity. And I think we can infer from that the perfectionism is the dark part of him, the part of him that exacts such high standards from his players, often which they can't meet, and which he then punishes them for in bizarre training rituals, or even the way he addresses them in the changing room, or sometimes ignores them in the changing rooms.
So we're saying, at this point, certainly Thomas Tuchel more hero than human.
At this point, I think Thomas Tuchel is unvarnished. And a lot of the rest of his career is going to be about trying to hide some of these darker elements of his personality.
So in just over 4 years, Thomas Tuchel has gone from being a nobody. Success has come almost immediately, but he's not an easy man to deal with. And his reputation for demanding perfection has a dark side. He lambasts his players, he lambasts himself when they don't deliver. But still and all, at this point, he's a massive success. At Mainz, a small club, he's achieved this great success with a team that has almost no history in the Bundesliga, that has no money. He's on track to beat the achievements of the club record, Jürgen Klopp, who just preceded him. And Tuchel looks to be on track to usurp Klopp as Germany's most innovative coach.
The rest of Thomas Tuchel's managerial career will be a battle between his clear coaching talents and the parts of his personality which are prone to combust. He ends up winning a Champions League, but so much else does go wrong.
Find out more after the break.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
This is a reminder that you're listening to the Heroes and Humans of Football podcast with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper.
Welcome back to Heroes and Humans. So it's 2014 and Thomas Tuchel has left Mainz and he goes on a sabbatical. Of course he does, because that's what his great idol Pep Guardiola does.
Yeah, Pep goes on sabbatical to New York just about a year before.
Pep Guardiola is a bit of a lodestar for Thomas Tuchel. And like Guardiola, he's going to use his time off to absorb insights and information from all different walks of life to help him in his career at this point, which is looking very promising as a brilliant football manager in Germany. Tuchel does lots of things in this period. One of the things that Thomas Tuchel does is approach a betting company owned by one Matthew Benham, who will go on to be the owner of Brentford. Tuchel realizes that betting companies have huge data sets on matches because they have to come up with odds and probabilities of who's going to win, lose or draw. And Tuchel wants access to those data sets because his whole job as a manager is to ensure that the odds are in his team's favour. He's also doing things like talking to coaches who work in the NBA, in handball, in wrestling. It's a time when he learns to meditate, he goes swimming a lot, and he loses a bit of weight. Thomas Tuchel is always constantly on this, what I think we would call now a wellness journey, something to detoxify and cleanse his brain and his body, all while being a football coach, a very, very demanding job.
Well, all while being a workaholic. So I read this interview on the Bayern website where they say, don't you need a holiday? And he says, for me, 2 hours out on the water is like a week's holiday. So then he immediately goes back to workaholism and watching
a very
videos
Teutonic
all night.
approach to work. The sabbatical actually culminates in this now legendary dinner with Pep Guardiola. Thomas talks a lot about how Pep and him, perhaps once a year or every few months, would have dinner, because Pep Guardiola at this point is also Bayern Munich, and he builds up a relationship with some of his favourite German coaches. They meet in 2014, in the summer of 2014, to eat and to discuss football.
Well, I would guess that Pep eats and Tuchel only discusses football.
With the salt and pepper shakers, apparently there's in that infamous story that they use the decoration on the table to work out some of their tactics or some of the methods that they both deploy. Thomas Tuchel is a massive Pep fanboy. I think, Simon, perhaps a bigger fanboy even than you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And like you, of course, he does idolise that team of the 90s. He then goes on to idolise the Messi team of the 2010s, and he actually does manage to beat Pep a couple of times with the little minnows of Mainz while Pep's at Bayern Munich. When a younger Thomas Tuchel is getting a lot of media attention at Mainz, he turns around to the journalists and says, Pep Guardiola, one of the greatest managers of his generation, never gives one-to-one interviews. So why the hell do I have to talk to you? And I think it's quite a striking comparison for this nobody guy to say the reason that I'm not going to talk to the press is because Pep Guardiola doesn't have to do it. So why the bloody hell should I have to talk to you guys all the time?
I wonder if Pep finds this slightly damaged that, Tuchel is becoming a kind of mini-me stalker type figure at this point.
Who's also determined to always beat him, of course. There's a story that one of the Mainz players tells, that there's a documentary on German TV about Pep Guardiola, which talks about his tactics. And there's a screenshot of some of the tactic boards that he has in the dressing room at Bayern Munich. Thomas Tuchel snaps the screenshot and he sits on the team bus, and the players describe that this guy is just looking at it, trying to decode it for hours and hours. So after dining with Pep Guardiola and going around all types of sports and learning from other coaches, in 2016, it's time for Tuchel to get back into management. Lots of teams want him. Bayer Leverkusen and Hamburg are some of the two that are really interested. But it's Borussia Dortmund, the club formerly managed by one certain Jürgen Klopp, who needs someone to take over the reins.
So poor old Tuchel, his whole career is just chasing after Klopp.
Thomas Tuchel is going to inherit a very strong team from Jürgen Klopp. This is a team which has players like Gundogan, Aubameyang, Mkhitaryan, Marco Reus, Mats Hummels, and a very, very young Ousmane Dembele. Dortmund at this point have strong players. They've developed a business model, which means they're not going to go bankrupt every other season. And so it's a brilliant opportunity for Thomas Tuchel, and not one that he even hesitates about taking. He doesn't think, oh my God, I'm going to go step back into the shadow of Jürgen Klopp, because at this point, I think Thomas Tuchel realizes or thinks and believes that he's a better manager than Jürgen Klopp. However, it's a pretty odd match from the very beginning. Thomas Tuchel is not the tub-thumping legend, emotional, crazed, big teeth, big personality of Jürgen Klopp. At first sight, Dortmund fans think he's pretty austere, a bit too cerebral, and he does things in that changing room that make him very unpopular from the beginning. And a perennial theme of Thomas Tuchel's career is food, not only the food he puts in his own body, but what he demands of the players. And one of the first things he does when he gets to the Dortmund changing room is to tell the team chef that the players are going to have no carbs, no sugars, and no hydration drinks. They drink water, they eat lots of protein, and that's how they fuel themselves. And this makes many enemies in that changing room, one of whom is Mats Hummels, very senior veteran figure at Dortmund.
World champion.
And world champion, who decides very quickly that he doesn't like this new guy's methods, and he's gone to Bayern the next season.
Yeah. No, I would myself would have left quite early. As we're talking, I'm reminded of our podcast on Wenger, and it sounds to me that what Tuchel is doing is an extreme version of Wengerism, this obsession with changing diets, with almost weightlessness, this discipline about eating that seems very alien to the way most people live and the history of football.
And I think it's probably directly connected to the idea of control. So when you are so disciplined and regimented about what you put inside your body, it's a sense of controlling how your body behaves. So when you eat carbs, it makes you feel lazy or it makes you feel jaded. That's why you don't eat carbs. He's really anti-sugar, right? Thomas Tuchel hates sugar. He talks about sugar like it's a real drug and the enemy.
Like people in the Nixon era used to talk about marijuana.
And that's why he stops his players also from consuming it in any of its form, including hydration drinks, which we often think of like quite benign and useful things for players to have.
But I mean, Klopp, our whole episode about him is that beside the charisma, there's this gift for empathy and for caring about people and understanding people. That doesn't seem to be a big part of Tuchel's methods.
He shows flashes of it. So you see him often being very tactile with his players, hugging them, being genuinely happy for them. One of the players at Mainz says that, he scored a goal, which meant he broke a sort of little record at the club. And he felt that the manager truly, truly was happy for him on a personal level. However, he manages to hide these flashes of empathy and affection with the kind of general, I think 90% of his personality most of the time, which is him being constantly demanding of his players. Tuchel spends 2 seasons at Dortmund, and looking back, they seem to be quite unhappy seasons. But statistically, he creates a better team than Jürgen Klopp's Dortmund. Under Thomas Tuchel, Borussia Dortmund averaged 2.06 points per game, which is better than Jürgen Klopp's record. They are also up against a very dominant Bayern Munich team, so Thomas Tuchel doesn't win the Bundesliga like Klopp. However, none of that actually really matters, because the truth is that Thomas Tuchel just can't connect with that yellow wall. He can't connect with the senior managers at Borussia Dortmund, and he just can't compete with the ghost of Klopp.
Which actually nobody can.
There are a couple of moments in his stint at Borussia Dortmund which show just how difficult and tense that relationship is. And it culminates in this very strange fake terrorist attack which happens on the Borussia Dortmund team bus while they're on their way to a Champions League match in 2017. Initially, this was considered to be a terrorist attack on the team bus, but it turns out it was some crazed fan who'd made a bet on the fact that Borussia Dortmund's stock price was going to go down, so he sort of petrol bombed the bus. The players are generally not hurt. A couple of them are injured with a few gashes, but it's quite traumatizing for the entire side, and it's made worse by the fact that UEFA forced them to play the game against Monaco with just a 24-hour break. So they have to keep going on playing, even though they've suffered what everyone thought was a terrorist attack. This is pretty rare, even in modern football.
But he's not very generous with his players.
There are reports in the German media afterwards that in the aftermath of the attack, a lot of the players were shaken up. Some of them were seen crying. And Thomas Tuchel reportedly turns to his senior executives and says, "How do you expect me to beat Bayern with this group of, quote, pussies?" Thomas Tuchel has always denied this, but I think once this gets out into the ether, it just creates a sense in which Tuchel is emotionally divorced from the needs of his players who've gone through a pretty traumatic event.
And he becomes quite paranoid about the ghost of Klopp.
Yes.
I mean, you would be, wouldn't you, if you always are succeeding Klopp?
And you're trying your best to beat the record of Klopp, but you're not getting close to the Bundesliga, right? There are stories about Jürgen Klopp's name being informally banned inside the Dortmund changing room at this time. So Jürgen Klopp becomes the Voldemort figure of Borussia Dortmund at this time. One of the senior executives described having a meeting with Tuchel where they're talking about some sort of changes they want to make to the stadium and to the pitch. He makes a benign comparison to how it used to be in the Klopp days, and Tuchel absolutely flips. He starts raging and screaming at the mention of the name of Jürgen Klopp. To make matters even worse, Dortmund play Jürgen Klopp's Liverpool in the Champions League. They lose a 3-1 lead, 4-3 in the Champions League in a second leg at Anfield, and it just seems to prove to Thomas Tuchel that nothing that he can do is ever going to match up to the standards of Jürgen Klopp, and that humiliation at Anfield just kind of tops it all off.
Last minute Lovren goal.
It is. At the end of his second season, Borussia Dortmund do what Borussia Dortmund do, and they start selling some of their best players. Tuchel doesn't like this. He rebels. He thinks this is a bad strategy. He doesn't want to stay. And let's be honest, he's seeing Klopp every night in his nightmares when he goes to bed. There's reports that he's really frustrated with the fact that he's always constantly being compared to Klopp. And he decides informally, or it's reported, that he never wants to manage Liverpool because he doesn't want to do this again. He doesn't want to step literally into the shoes of Jürgen Klopp. And he doesn't even want to manage in the Premier League. And in fact, in 2018, when other clubs are interested in him, including Chelsea, Thomas Tuchel says, "I do not want to go to the Premier League because that dude with the big teeth and the glasses is there. And instead, he ends up in your neck of the woods.
He comes
Simon,
to Paris,
in Paris.
He comes to Paris Saint Germain, where nobody tells the players what to do because the players are superstars, but Tuchel tells them what to do. So the first away game, they're on the team bus, and Marco Verratti, the little Italian playmaker, says, "Oh, can I have a Coke?" Because, of course, that's how you prepare for a match.
Yeah.
He drinks Coke. Verratti's told, I guess, by the steward, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, there are no Cokes here." And it turns out that Tuchel has banned all soft drinks and sandwiches.
He hates carbs, yeah.
Yeah, well, so Verratti thinks I've got to change my liquid intake, and instead he very soon afterwards gets charged with drunk driving.
Because he can't drink Coke.
I don't think it's what Tuchel had in mind for him.
But how does he get on, Simon, at PSG?
Well, he sort of understands that in Paris, Neymar and Kylian Mbappe are more important than the coach. And Tuchel has amazingly worked this out. And so this intense, prickly, authoritarian figure that we know from Germany becomes much more agreeable and even chummier in Paris. And he decides, I have to make friends with the star players. And so he goes to meet Neymar twice before the World Cup. He hugs Neymar. When Neymar's not around, Tuchel writes him texts to tell him that he still believes in Neymar, that he's sad he's not here. You see this very energetic attempt to pretend to be a human being, which he carries off to some degree.
I think once he's left Germany, and there's no need to compare him to Klopp anymore because he's out of the country and he's not managing a team that Klopp's managed, I think some of that prickliness does actually fall away temporarily. And
language is very important to how he works because he believes in deep communication, different communication for every player. He takes courses to improve his French and Spanish. Spanish is really the language of Paris Saint Germain, sometimes a bit of Italian too. Because Tuchel thinks, I have to communicate with every player according to his own needs. So at Mainz, he discovers, Christoph Biermann writes this, he discovers at Mainz one of the players is motivated by money. That's why he plays football. He wants win bonuses, he wants a lucrative transfer. And when Tuchel finds this out, he thinks, yeah, great, that makes man management really easy. You just talk to this guy about money, that's what drives him. And so he's decided that Neymar wants love, and so Tuchel gives him love. He works the players much harder than they used to because, you don't sign up for PSG to have this kind of Spartan training regime and not eat food. And Tuchel obviously is like that. But he also goes to nightclubs with the players. There's this hazing ritual, which you have a lot of clubs that you have to sing a song in front of the group.
Initiation song, yeah.
Initiation song. He sings Pharrell Williams' Happy.
Did you just say Pharrell? Can we keep that in?
Sorry, you say it.
This guy's going after me for my pronunciation. No, that's so good.
It's
Pharrell.
Pharrell.
You don't need to say Williams.
Okay, he sings Pharrell's Happy. Apologies to all our listeners.
Yeah, you can do Ralf Rangnick, but you can't do Pharrell. Pam, you need to get your priorities straight.
And at the Parc des Princes, when they read out the lineups, often the fans will cheer Tuchel's name, or as I say in Paris, Tuchel.
Tuchel.
And they actually almost win the Champions League. It's in the COVID hit season, they get to the final, and where they lose to Bayern. They actually had chances to win.
They did. They should have won. Neymar and Mbappe both should have scored before Kingsley Coman does eventually score in that empty stadium in Portugal.
Tuchel is wearing a leg brace. Of course, he hugs Neymar. Neymar must be getting a bit fed up with all the Tuchel hugs at this point.
So Neymar is inconsolable. I just remember him breaking down in tears on the pitch. And Thomas Tuchel, who's in a leg brace, a massive leg brace, sort of hobbles on. I mean, as if he isn't awkward enough already, right? I honestly thought this was the moment that they were going to do it. And against Bayern of all teams. And they should have won that. They should have won that Champions League final.
But still, for Paris, it's a great success. First time they ever reached the final. You'd think, this guy, he's friendly with the stars. He's made this team better. He's going to be around for a while. No, 3 months after the final, he's sacked because he has a bust-up with the club director, Leonardo. So he really, he needs to work on his personal skills.
But this is a Thomas Tuchel cycle. And then you can just see it through his press conferences. I think at the end of that season, just before the Champions League final, he's snapping at the media. He's saying that you guys are constantly demanding that we win 4 or 5-0. This is completely unrealistic. You do not really understand football. And that's how you could usually chart the prickly part of his personality starts coming up to the fore, right? It always seems to happen this way. And having a massive bust up with Leonardo is, of course, the classic Tuchel thing. As soon as he's unhappy, he has huge fights with the executives and he gives them almost no choice but to fire him. And that's exactly how it happens at PSG, despite coming so close to the Holy Grail of the Champions League.
But luckily for him, there's this moneyed, hyper-ambitious club in London where there always seems to be a managerial vacancy.
There is. Chelsea, of course. And at the beginning of 2021, when we're still in strange lockdown football, Chelsea have just sacked their legendary player, not legendary manager Frank Lampard.
Your beloved Chelsea and your beloved Lampard.
On my beloved birthday, it happens in January.
Chelsea, I'm guessing they send you an automated email on your birthday.
They do, and then there was another email saying club statement, the two words that I fear, that all Chelsea fans fear, club statement with a link. That club statement said Frank Lampard was going to go. At this point, I wanted Frank Lampard to go. We just got battered by Leicester or something, and it was tough. And also during lockdown, football becomes so much more important because there's nothing else to do. So I was back into this toxic cycle of emotional investment into Chelsea.
I'm hoping that this podcast will get you out of that and help you see football in a more dispassionate way.
I think Chelsea are doing pretty well, helping me emotionally detach myself from them. Let's put it that way.
They're doing their best,
Yeah. I'm not sure we need the podcast for that. At the beginning of 2021, Chelsea are 9th in the league. And Thomas Tuchel is one of the candidates, but there are lots of candidates. There's always candidates. Roman Abramovich always has a list, a short list of the potential managers of Chelsea, even when they have a good manager that they're keeping. But Tuchel's unusual because he's been maybe on a 2-month, 6-week break. It's not been long since he sacked from Paris, but he really, really wants this job because he spent a couple of those weeks looking at this stacked Chelsea team. It's a huge squad, and he thinks these guys are very, very talented. They're just really disorganized, and they don't know what is the best formation to play. I really want to manage them. And actually, it's through force of will that he convinces Abramovich and Marina Granitskaya at that point, who both are the two most senior people at the club, the owner and the right-hand woman, Marina. And he says, I really want this job.
What, so he kind of contacts Chelsea himself?
Yes. He manages to convince them because he thinks that I can actually do something with this team. He's not the first choice, but he persuades the owners that this is what he really wants to do. And at the outset, this is quite a strange decision. You're putting your hand up to work for, as we know, a very capricious Russian oligarch. Please listen to our episode on Roman Abramovich. And a guy who basically fires his managers every other season or so. But Tuchel is desperate to do it. And so much so that Abramovich gives him an 18-month contract and he takes it, which an 18-month contract for a new manager is basically a stay of execution. It's sort of saying, you got 6 months to prove that you're the guy, otherwise you're out. And Tuchel is asked at his first press conference, why Chelsea and why an 18-month contract? And he says, well, why Chelsea? Why not? And I know that if I'm not going to perform, they're going to sack me anyway. So why do I need a 5-year contract? And it's at this point where I see this slightly dorky German with big ears and slightly too big teeth in his blue tracksuit, speaking perfect English, charming the journalists over Zoom. They're not even in the room. And I'm won over. And I fall in love again with another manager and so many more hopes.
Well, looking back, why did you fall in love with Tuchel?
There is something very captivating about him. And I think it's his mastery of English, which is really helpful. I could listen to Thomas Tuchel talk about anything for a very long time. That's not true of Pep Guardiola, who sometimes I find incoherent in English. Jürgen Klopp is funny and entertaining, but I don't think I ever learn anything from him. Tuchel has this incredible poise in English. He's very precise with his use of language. He's also able to be funny in subtle ways. And there's something just really, really captivating about him. And it's not just me. I think most Chelsea fans who wouldn't have known much about this guy, he says all the right things. In his first couple of press conferences, he says, I want Chelsea to be a really hard team to beat. He says, I want to be the kind of team that nobody wants to play against. And this is kind of echoing the ghosts of Mourinho, right? That hard to beat, tough side where winning is everything. And it works. Of course it does. This is the first stage of the Tuchel cycle. And the thing that he does very quickly is he realizes that he's got a group of players that are disjointed, but they used to be very successful playing a certain formation, which is the back three. This is the formation where they won the league under Antonio Conte. And in his first match, Tuchel decides, let's just go back to the back three and see how it works. The first game, it's a 0-0 draw against Wolves, but we're already far better than we've performed over the last couple of months. And he sticks with the system. Back three, really aggressive wing backs, pins them right up to the pitch. Aggressive centre backs. We're doing a lot of pressing. They press as a full team and they also attack as a full team. So you have basically a back five and a front five. And it works very, very quickly, very, very well. Within the first 3 months of being a manager at Chelsea, Thomas Tuchel beats Pep Guardiola, Jürgen Klopp, Jose Mourinho, and Carlo Ancelotti.
I was thinking the most exciting thing for him about coming to England is that he's in the same league again as Pep Guardiola.
Yes, he is. And he, again, is reanimated by his desire to beat Pep Guardiola, and something that he's never done up until that point. He also beats Jürgen Klopp. Chelsea go to Anfield. They win 1-0 in a game that they should have won, perhaps by more goals. It's an empty stadium. But again, you see that Thomas Tuchel's tactics, his meticulousness, his attention to detail, his actual ability to get players to get on board with what he's trying to do works really, really quickly. He takes a team that were 9th in the league, he gets them to Champions League qualification, which is 4th. And then, of course, his biggest triumph of his career, he wins the Champions League in 2021 against his great lodestar, Pep Guardiola.
And Guardiola must be a bit irritated at this point. This stalker German dude, his German fanboy, beats him in the Champions League final.
Who he's forced to take to dinner every year out of some weird tradition that he has not developed himself. There's a clip before that match in Porto where Chelsea, of course, are the underdogs. And it's a clip of Thomas Tuchel, who gets caught by cameras who are basically hiding in a bush. And he's talking to his coaches and he's mocking Pep Guardiola. He's doing this, you know, the Pep Guardiola dance?
I should say, for those not watching on video,
I'm flailing my arms around.
Mehreen is waving her arms around like a crazy person.
Yes, which is one of the clips that goes viral from that documentary on Amazon that goes behind the scenes at Manchester City, where Pep's moving around. He's all limbs moving around like a madman, trying to get his players to, follow his instructions.
Tuchel has obviously watched that documentary repeatedly.
And he's taking the piss. And then he realizes that he's being filmed and he turns to the cameras and he smiles. And I think that's at that point where I think maybe Thomas Tuchel is managing to get under the skin of Pep Guardiola. And Pep uncharacteristically loses his mind in that final. He picks the most bizarre starting lineup with no strikers and way too many midfielders, and they lose the game. And I think Tuchel actually does get under his skin, because at this point, I think Pep is thinking, how do I beat a team that are quite difficult to beat? They've already beat me twice in the last month. We need to do something special to beat this Chelsea side. And Pep actually abandons his own identity in that final. And Chelsea win, I think deservedly so. It's a bit hairy at the end, but Kai Havertz, much maligned, scores the goal in the first half. It ends 1-0. And Thomas Tuchel, without a leg brace this time, runs onto the pitch like a crazed madman. And it's the biggest triumph of his career.
And remains so to this day.
So the Thomas Tuchel honeymoon, those first 4 or 5 months are incredible. They almost always are.
In Tuchel's teams, they always are.
They always are. And there's testimonies from players in that squad. One of the most striking is from Antonio Rudiger, who I think listeners may have realised is a theme that I bring up a lot in these episodes because I think he's absolutely brilliant. But Rudiger has a really, really tough time at Chelsea before Tuchel arrives. He's a pariah in that squad. And there's press reports that he was part of a group of players that actually pushed Lampard out. And this means that Chelsea fans are hitting this guy with death threats, that they're harassing him, they're making threats against his family, and he's having an awful time. When Tuchel arrives in this team, he goes up to Rudiger, who's a fellow German, and he says to him, Tony, you're really, really aggressive on the pitch. Tell me why and where does this come from? And Rudiger talks to Tuchel about growing up in one of the rougher parts of Berlin, in Neukölln, where he's playing on concrete pitches and he's such an aggressive young defender that some of his older teammates call him Rambo. And he was like, I sort of imbibed his Rambo personality really early on. Rudiger then becomes one of the most important players in this system, in Tuchel's system, where he's an aggressive centre-back. He's always pushing up into midfield and pressing and harrying the opposition right up the pitch. And Rudiger says, Tuchel gave me a new life. And when he gave me a chance, I made up my mind that I was going to give 200% to this guy, this badge, despite everything that was said about me before at Chelsea. I think it's no coincidence that Tony Rudiger sadly leaves Chelsea a couple of years later on a free transfer, is now one of the most successful, I think one of the best defenders in the world right now, playing for Real Madrid. And just as we've recorded, he scores the winning penalty to beat Manchester City in the Champions League quarter-final. And everything about Rudiger's career changes in that moment that Tuchel arrives at Chelsea. Before that, he was actually going to be sold to Tottenham.
Oh my God, the ignominy.
Nobody deserves that, you know?
But the Thomas Tuchel cycle always turns.
It does. And the second season at Chelsea, where they signed Lukaku for 100 million, because at this point, Roman Abramovich is willing to throw money at this coach who's won him only his second Champions League ever. But it all goes wrong. Lukaku turns out to be a disaster, and Chelsea just cannot keep up with the juggernaut that is Pep Guardiola and Manchester City.
And then there's also the problem that Russia invades Ukraine during the season.
Yeah. Some geopolitics gets involved, intrudes into football.
Roman Abramovich's situation in England becomes more complicated, shall we say?
It does.
He has to sell the club.
He has to sell the club, which are put into for sale in March 2022. And Tuchel actually at this time, despite all the things we've said about him being so volatile, becomes a kind of stalwart. And he's going out into the media every other week, even though there's so much drama going on around the club and its sale. And he gets a lot of respect from the fans and also from the outside world. And he actually says that I felt an obligation to be the face of the club at a time when so much is changing. I felt an obligation to these players, to this team, to this city, to stay and to commit myself to Chelsea. And I think at this point, he's also really committed to Chelsea. He thinks he's going to be here for a pretty long time. There's no story.
Always a mistake to think that at Chelsea, by the way.
There is. He falls into the trap, right, of thinking that he's actually going to be here for a while. There's no stories of him having meltdowns or being particularly horrible to his players. Chelsea do lose 2 consecutive cup finals, however, to the man who's always in his rearview mirror, Jürgen Klopp.
That is very, very cruel. Nobody, I think, could handle that.
And it's not games in which Chelsea really deserve to lose. They're both on penalties, which is the worst way to lose. To Kloppo in cup finals. So again, the ghost of Jürgen Klopp is still there, haunting him at Chelsea. In the summer of 2022, once the club has been sold, Chelsea get new owners, these hedge fund, private equity bros from Clear Lake Capital.
These are these super competent, hyper-professional people who really understand football deeply, right?
Right. And also own the LA Dodgers. So it's kind of in the Liverpool mold, right? Sports franchises owned by American investors who think the Premier League, clubs are really, undervalued and we can make loads of money from them.
Yeah, I would have to say that the FSG group that runs Liverpool has been more competent and intelligent so far than the Todd Boehly people who run Chelsea.
Definitely, we can say that with the benefit of hindsight. And the funny thing is that Todd Boehly and co. look at Tuchel and they say, this guy is a brilliant asset for us. He's won the biggest trophy in Europe and we want to work with him and he's our man. However, very, very quickly that relationship sours because Thomas Tuchel starts behaving in bizarre ways. He has a huge amount of turmoil in his personal life. His partner, his long-standing partner of nearly 15 to 20 years, leaves him. There are reports that he is seduced by some of the bright lights of West London, let's put it that way. And they don't think these hyper-professional Americans, who, even if they know nothing about football, definitely know about personnel, don't think that they can work with this man anymore. And at the beginning of that 3rd season, he is very, very abruptly sacked. Now, what does Thomas Tuchel do once he's been sacked?
He goes on a purity purge.
He goes to India for 6 weeks to stay in a retreat where people refer to him as a patient and does a very deep, very intense detox. He needs a break from football. He later describes that actually his sacking was a huge surprise. He wasn't expecting it. He gets a call from Todd Boehly and co., drives to the training ground and says their conversation lasted no more than 3 minutes. Because I think as soon as Tuchel hears the word, sadly, Thomas, it's time for us to part ways, he's out of the door and gone because he's very, very angry at this moment. And he disappears off the face of the earth. And it's only later that it emerges that Thomas Tuchel decides that he's going to go on an eat, pray, love journey to the south of India and spend 6 weeks in a retreat where he does nothing but meditate, do lots of yoga, and take in the methods of Ayurvedic healing. He describes being in this place where people call the attendees patients, on a deep, deep detox where he doesn't eat any sugar and no carbs for 6 weeks. He loses a lot of weight.
Well, which for him is, I would say, quite borderline dangerous.
Pretty difficult.
Yeah.
And he's eating ghee all the time, which is his form of clarified butter, which is pretty tough on your stomach. I
would have to say, in the heyday of the British tabloids, all the other so-called patients at the retreat would have been tabloid journalists spying
who would
on
have
Tuchel.
checked in with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this only emerges later, right? So we don't really know where Thomas has gone. And then he does a video for the nice owners of his clinic. He sits down with them for 45 minutes and he talks about what a brilliant experience he's had and how he's the only bloke there, right? Because he's basically just surrounded by, I think, quite well-heeled, privileged white women in the middle of nowhere in India.
Who are paying a lot of money to eat ghee and wake up at 5 in the morning and do yoga. Yeah.
In their Lululemon joggers, hanging out with Thomas Tuchel. But he gets a huge amount from this. I think it's also one of the themes, his sort of borderline spirituality and also the punishment that he poses on his own body when he thinks that he's failed to meet his own standards.
So at Chelsea, we've seen a kind of condensed version of the Tuchel cycle. Starts on a high.
The highest of highs, a Champions League trophy.
A year later, the owners don't like him anymore, and he's sacked, and then he ends up a patient
Effectively in rehab.
in rehab.
Yeah. So the Thomas Tuchel, the extremities of the Thomas Tuchel cycles get far more extreme, with every single job that he has.
And they seem to move faster. So at the next club, this whole thing could be condensed into 20 minutes.
I don't even think they have a honeymoon period at Bayern Munich, which is a good point to get on to the final section where we talk about legacy. And with Thomas Tuchel, I guess the story is yet to finish. He's younger than a lot of his generational peers. He's only 50 compared to Pep and Klopp, who are a little bit older. And in 2023, the circumstances of his departure at Chelsea don't actually mean that nobody wants to touch this guy. In fact, he's still very much in demand, and Bayern Munich come calling.
Yeah, because Bayern Munich have sacked Tuchel's own prodigy, Nagelsmann, while he was on a skiing holiday in 2023. And they say to Tuchel, well, obviously all you Tuchel, Nagelsmann, Rangnick types, you always just replace each other. So come and win us the Champions League.
Which is a pretty good bet, because Tuchel he got to 2 consecutive finals, one with PSG and with Chelsea, and he wins with Chelsea. And Bayern at this point want to rescue their season. They're probably going to win the Bundesliga. They always win the Bundesliga. But they really want to win the Champions League, and they've been drawn against Man City. So they're like, we need the guy who knows exactly how to win the Champions League and to beat Man City, Thomas Tuchel. Julian Nagelsmann going skiing was one of the worst holiday decisions he's ever made. Although
to me, better than going to a retreat in India where you have to wake up at 5 a.m. and eat ghee.
True, but Manuel Neuer also went skiing and he broke a leg, didn't he? So if you're around Bayern Munich, don't go skiing.
Yeah.
It's ominous.
I've actually never been skiing, so I can't comment.
No way! You're a very bad Northern European. Even I've been skiing, bro. I'm brown. Anyway, it doesn't work out. The bet fails. Thomas Tuchel takes over Bayern Munich and they lose to Manchester City in the Champions League. And they win the Bundesliga by a whisker because Dortmund throw it all away in the last match. The Thomas Tuchel cycle doesn't even manage to hit phase 1.
So we promised you at the beginning of the episode, we would ask, do we want Thomas Tuchel to be England manager? Mehreen, let's just imagine the FA come out next week and say, we have appointed white smoke, etc., and this German jumps out of the box.
This big toothy grin of his.
How are we going to feel about this?
So, first question I always have with domestic club managers who go into international football is that, are they going to be able to deal with the fact that they're not going to see these players all the time? The fact that they just get to, they're bestowed upon them at the grace of their clubs once every 2 months. They get to train with them a week now and then in mid-season breaks. Can Tuchel, the intense, dark Tuchel,
fanatical workaholic,
can he cope with this, underemployment? Effectively, that's what national managers are. They're underemployed.
You just sit in the stands and try to stay interested match after match after match.
So my immediate thoughts, everything that we've said in this episode, is no, that he's used to a certain level of intensity, the emotional bonds, maybe some of the psychological torture that he puts his players through, that he will just not be able to do, and he'd be really frustrated in a national team job.
Yeah, so the players would turn up, they're playing Slovenia away, and they're knackered between Champions League matches, and then he wants to do 6 days of intensive coaching where they don't even get to eat pasta.
Yeah, and they have to run around a lot, and he has to maybe untrain all of the habits that he's learned at club environment. So I think, on the surface level, I would say he wouldn't really fit any national team. We're also in a position, however, that there are not clubs queuing up to hire this man for all of the reasons we've mentioned in this episode. So he might just have to take any job that he's given.
It's a well-paid, prestigious job, and
he loves England. He loves London. He's spoken very fondly about the city. It might be a weird sense of redemption coming back and reviving himself in a environment where he probably thinks he was super hard done by at Chelsea.
And it's a very good group of players. And the thing that the next coach needs to do is to create a team that plays domineering football. We have the ball, we play on your half, we press, we play at high tempo, we have positional changes.
He does all of those things incredibly well with his teams.
And, Pep and Klopp do those as well, but they're not going to coach England. So if England want a coach to create dominant football, Tuchel could be that man.
And if we think about one way to ameliorate all of the slightly darker parts of his character, perhaps being a national team manager will help, because he can't do all of the things we've just mentioned, the intensity, the psychological abuse, all that sort of stuff. He isn't able to kind of show that part of himself, which might be the way to rescue his managerial career. So in a weird way, maybe England is exactly what he needs.
So we're saying he's psychologically totally unfit for the role?
And that's why he should get the role.
And as a football coach, he might actually do a good footballing job of it.
And as I said before, I might even be tempted to root for England if Thomas Tuchel is manager.
What, just because he has a Chelsea past, or you have a special
No,
feeling
I
for
just
him as
kind of,
well?
I mean, as we've already spoken about, he's my Batman, so I am drawn to him at all times.
Right, he's like the dangerous character in the movie.
Yeah, he's the anti-hero. And maybe England could just be the thing that saves him from himself.
It's hard being an anti-hero in the most exposed role in football in terms of media coverage and obsessiveness about what the England manager gets up to.
So if it happens, it's going to go really bad or it'll go really well.
Yeah, it'll go well on the field and disastrously off it.
We've hedged our bets.
So has Tuchel learned anything from his experiences, from this ever-shortening cycle of immense success to being kind of vomited out of his club?
On the face of it, the answer's no. And that's because the cycles get shorter and shorter. At Mainz, I think he had a solid 3 seasons. At Chelsea, we could probably put it at 1.5 at best. And at Bayern, there's almost nothing at all. Even in that first summer where he's manager, he's moaning about transfers. He's saying that he doesn't have enough midfielders. He's going after Joshua Kimmich. The worst parts of his personality come out really, really quickly at Bayern Munich, which would suggest that Thomas Tuchel is not maturing and he isn't learning from his mistakes. As it stands, that Champions League title is still the only major triumph of his career.
What, you don't respect the winning the Uber Eats League with PSG?
He won the Uber Eats League with PSG, and he won a Bundesliga by the skin of his teeth because Dortmund threw it. And it was I think it was Nagelsmann's Bundesliga, because I don't think he can take much credit for that. And he wins a cup in Dortmund, but that, of course, was nothing compared to what Klopp did at Dortmund. And so the big question hanging over his head, is any big club ever going to take a punt on him, given the well-publicized dark nature of his personality? And I think one of the teams that he would love to manage is Barcelona. Do you think he'd be a good fit for Barcelona, Simon? You resident expert of Barcelona?
I wrote the book, or one of the many books about Barcelona. Barcelona is a club and Barcelona is a city that's built on the good life of seafood restaurants, of Basque specialty places. There is a beach. I just don't see it as Tuchel Town. No, it's not an ascetic kind of place. I've never met an ascetic person in Barcelona. Yeah.
But given that we're doing legacy, I think there's lots of fascinating parts of Thomas Tuchel's character, which are not the norm among most managers in modern football today. And one of them is spirituality, of course. And let's be honest, poor Glenn Hoddle wouldn't have got away with being into Ayurvedic medicine or alternative methods of healing, right?
You're saying that the public and the media are much more accepting and perhaps credulous about this Ayurvedic stuff than they might have been in the day.
I think everyone's way more into wellness culture and thinking about how Eastern
He's a fanatic of wellness. That's the worrying thing. That's kind of, you crystallised it for me.
Yeah, he is. He is a wellness fanatic. And actually, Glenn Hoddle is one of his mates, because Thomas Tuchel was a Tottenham fan when he was much younger. So he loves Glenn Hoddle. I don't think they share, maybe they've had that chat about how spiritual they are.
I think Hoddle got a bit of a shock when he was sacked.
I think Hoddle got a hard time, and we're obviously going to talk about that when we do a Hoddle
podcast. Yeah,
he lives a very threadbare life, Thomas Tuchel. He's fastidious with his diet. He almost never drinks and doesn't like eating dessert.
Yeah, there's this story he tells that he went to Italy for a month at one point, and he didn't eat pasta or pizza.
Yeah,
which kind of removes most of the point.
I think this part of himself does mean that he is able to command respect from players, because again, I think aesthetics play a big role, and this is something that we usually discuss with managers, is the way that he looks. So in his 30s, Tuchel's a little bit awkward looking. He's got a bad haircut. He's got these blonde streaks, and he's got a bit of a chubby face. There's some water retention going on. But when he gets to PSG, you see this guy like wearing a roll neck. He's really skinny, 0% body fat, and he could pass for like some sort of androgynous model for Louis Vuitton. He's changed his whole look. And even though he looks like a razor-thin monk, he's still a bit goofy. He's got this toothy smile and those big ears. And I think that undercuts some of the sort of intimidating nature of his aura. He is both human and also a little bit subhuman. That's why I think he's kind of got a Batman thing going on.
Well, I think you're being generous with him. I mean, when you discussed the look of Wenger or Ancelotti, you were not so kind.
I wasn't very kind to Ancelotti. No, I didn't say anything bad about Ancelotti. But yeah, I guess...
You said he had the least suited body to wearing a tracksuit of any man you'd ever seen.
That was a compliment. That means that he looks really good in suits, Simon.
Right, okay.
Of course. Don't take it personally. Jeez. No, I mean, I think his whole look and his vibe of being an ascetic sort of shows that he's quite into self-flagellation. So he puts his own body through punishment, and that's through diet and very rigorous exercise. Again, as you said, doesn't eat pasta or pizza when he goes to Italy. He loves swimming. And there's stories about how one of his very close friends when he's at Dortmund is a brilliant tennis player and one of the best of his generation. And Thomas Tuchel's playing tennis against this guy every single week and getting his ass whooped because
he likes pain. He likes
feels
suffering.
that he deserves that. And I think that maybe that part of the discipline and the pain that he poses on himself means that he is able to command a lot of respect from athletes and athletes that are much younger than him.
Yeah, but the thing about being a manager is that everyone in the club has a lot of contact with you. The players, the staff, the directors, the media, the fans see you all the time. And that means that if you have an obnoxious personality, you very quickly wear out your welcome. And so actually niceness and politeness are massive assets in football managers as well as all the other stuff. And so you see that with Ancelotti and Klopp, that they're just easier to be around than Tuchel is.
They are, but he's not obnoxious. And there are flashes of deep, warm affection that he shows to his players. That's something that I saw at Chelsea. You even hear that now when he talks about players like Neymar or Ousmane Dembele, players that he says are the most talented players that he's ever come across. And I think it's easy to dismiss Tuchel as just a weirdo and a loser, but he's not.
Yeah, he's clearly not a loser. He clearly has very deep insights and understanding of football. But, we come to one of our ritual questions at the end. Would you like to spend an evening with him? I mean, me, so not.
Yeah, because he wouldn't eat anything and you'd be sitting there starving and you definitely wouldn't drink anything.
Yeah, no, if I did meet him, I would pre-eat. So I would show up already having had my dinner.
He had a packet of crisps.
Yeah.
I would definitely love to spend some time with him because I really want to work out what makes this guy tick and why he's unable to suppress the worst parts of himself when, even though it's really expedient to do so, right? Just to get on, just to make the owner a little bit happy. Be a bit more Ancelotti, right?
Yeah, he doesn't really have much diplomacy in him.
He's not malleable at all. And he's not biddable at all, which sometimes is a characteristic that you admire in people. And I often admire in people. People who have conviction and people who are quite, I guess, steadfast in the way that they think is the right way to behave. There's a certain kind of moralism attached to the way that he is.
Yeah, well, and this brings us to our other question about the person. What would he have been if he hadn't been in football? And I'm going to say he'd have been a monk in a really punishing, demanding religious tradition.
Yeah,
where you have to beat yourself.
Not a
with
Franciscan,
a whip on
not
the back.
one of the nice, cool ones, like a proper hardcore one. I think he'd be a yogi.
Yeah, but one of these yogis where you have to do like month-long fasts and wake up in the morning and beat yourself with a whip on your naked back, sort of thing.
Opus Dei. Well, so unlike Klopp, he's never actually spoken about believing in God in a traditional sense. But perhaps his spirituality is a more modern one or more Eastern one.
It's a very 21st century wellness spirituality, which is about not eating and purifying your body all the time.
But I don't think he does it because it's trendy. I think it's
he generally
part
believes
of
this
him.
stuff, yeah.
And it helps him. He talks about that trip to India, basically helping reset his life. I think he's actually back with his wife now, so he sort of resets himself in a classic kind of Hollywood movie way, like he is Julia Roberts in Eat, Pray, Love, basically.
Right.
Which is why you guys could never hang out. Is there anything that you hate more than spirituality and not eating?
I don't hate spirituality. I just find it very baffling.
Cloying?
And when people start talking about it, I switch off a bit.
You do switch off. It's a bit like this podcast when I start speaking. So there we have it. Thomas Tuchel, a complicated bloke, but one, I think, who is redeemable. And he can be fixed, and I want to fix him.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. Next week, Heroes and Humans is taking a short break for the summer. But don't worry, we'll be back with an Olympic special the week later. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.